Nations, a philosophy podcast recorded at the University of Chicago. I'm Matt Teichman.
And I'm Mark Hopwood.
With us today is Martha Nussbaum, Ernst Freund Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. And she is here to talk with us about the capabilities approach. Martha Nussbaum, welcome.
Well, hi. It's great to be back on the podcast.
The capabilities approach has largely defined itself in contrast to other approaches to measuring how developed a country is. So maybe we could start by asking about one of the standard ways of measuring that, namely GDP. Do you think that GDP is a good metric for determining how prosperous a country is?
Okay, well, for a long time in the development world, people thought it was, GDP per capita, of course, and they thought that it was just the best single number that you could have. Now, I think nowadays people doubt even that if you want a single number focused on economic issues, average household income is actually a more pertinent number because GDP picks up on foreign investment, and the profits of foreign investment are often repatriated by the investing nation, and therefore they don't actually improve the quality of life of the people in that country. So even the narrower type of economists that we're arguing against would nowadays prefer to use average household income. But beyond that, any single number that's an average fails to take distribution into account, and it can give very high marks to nations that contain staggering inequalities. So that South Africa under apartheid, where 95% of the country failed to qualify for the fruits of the nation's prosperity, would rank very high because there was a lot of stuff around there, never mind who controlled it. Now, that leads me to the second problem with GDP. It doesn't pick out and separately study a lot of different elements of the quality of a human life that are very pertinent to development. Things such as health, education, longevity, but also the quality of political liberties, religious liberty, race relations, gender relations. Now, the latter group, that is the political and civil and religious liberties, are not well correlated at all with GDP, as the staggering success of China and Singapore can show you right off the bat. But even health and education, so even goods that look socioeconomic, are actually not that well correlated with the average GDP. My collaborators, Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze, have for years studied the different Indian states where health and education are subjects that the Constitution gives to the states to manage. So it's like an experimental laboratory because the states pursue different economic initiatives, but they also run the health and education. And what we find is that pursuing a growth-based agenda doesn't trickle down to deliver improvement in health and education. So states like Andhra Pradesh and Gujarat that have shot for growth have not improved the quality of education and health, whereas Kerala, which is usually the gold star child of the development literature because it does have 99% adolescent literacy in both males and females against a background of 65% male literacy and 50% female literacy in the nation as a whole. Kerala is actually a poor state whose economy has not grown well. Now, I don't think that's good. I think they should have pursued different economic policies. But fact is, they've been able to improve not only education, but also health. Their health outcomes are the same as those of Harlem in New York. Now, that's shameful for the U.S. It shows you the staggering inequalities in our own system of healthcare distribution. But it's a pretty good thing for a poor state in India. So in short, it doesn't tell you how people are really doing. Now, maybe you would move on next to a utility-based approach that would measure how well people are doing by looking at total or average utility, but that has some of the same problems. Again, it's an average, and it can give high marks to inequalities, and it's also an aggregate. It doesn't separate out and differently consider different aspects of quality of life. But the utility-based approach has a couple of other problems that are worth mentioning, and that is that because it's based on the satisfaction of people's preferences, it doesn't grapple with the problem of what the economists like to call adaptive preferences. That is, preferences where people tailor their sights to the level they think they can expect. People don't like to live lives of hopeless longing for the most part, and so they learn not to want and long for things that their political culture has put out of their reach. So women don't report dissatisfaction with the amount of education that they've achieved. So that's another big problem for the utility approach. And then another final problem is it's a philosophically interesting one, that it focuses on a state of satisfaction rather than on agency and really being involved in your life. And so if you think of the famous thought experiment that Bob Nozick concocted, the experience machine, it could give high marks to the guy who's plugged into the experience machine and who feels satisfied but is not active at all. So for all those reasons, we reject that approach as well, even though it's a little bit more interesting than the GDP approach.
So that's a lot of different approaches. So to summarize, I guess what we're interested in is development, how well a nation, or particularly its people, are doing, whether the nation and the people are flourishing. And you've talked about the ways in which very basic, quantifiable economic measures don't seem to work for tracking that. So there are ways in which nations can be doing well in GDP, they can be doing well in more sensitive metrics like household income, and still be doing poorly in other areas, health and education were two that you mentioned, that we think are important for a flourishing country or flourishing people. But then the bare idea of just doing well, if we consider that in terms of the satisfaction of people's preferences, also doesn't seem to be a great metric. We have the problem there of adaptive preferences. People just get used to a bad state of things. So all of that leads us fairly neatly to the approach that Amartya Sen in particular and yourself put forward, the capability approach. One thing that you mentioned earlier was the range of different things that we might be aiming at when we're thinking about a nation or a people doing well, that there are these very different scales on which we can be doing well. It's not obvious that they can all be boiled down to one. And it seems like this idea of a kind of irreducible diversity in different ways in which we can be doing well is central to the capabilities approach. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think that it's intuitively pretty obvious that if you ask people how they're doing, they often give you a very complicated answer. They might say, well, you know, my health is good, but one of my children is unemployed, and furthermore, I'm worried about the future of political liberties in my country. If you're in China, for example, you might say that. And so they give you a mixed answer. And so the aim of the capabilities approach, like a good national constitution, is to spell that out, say which are the things that we really should be striving for each and every person. Now, you can do this just comparatively, and what the Human Development Reports of the United Nations Development Program do is simply to have comparative rankings and to rank nations in a different way. And so now you can look down the table and find out how infant mortality or maternal mortality, 100 things are doing in lots of different countries. What I've done is to go one step further and ask which are the central ones in terms of basic social justice, which are the ones that up to some threshold level have to be guaranteed to each and every nation if you're to lay claim to even a minimal level of decency and basic justice. And I do that partly because I think you do have to get specific if you're going to really do anything with this approach. I mean, we could compare the capability of standing on your head and singing Yankee Doodle Dandy. Who would want to do that, right? So implicitly, even in the UN report, they get specific when they pick the ones that are interesting to compare. But I'm interested in constitutional law and constitution making. And when nations get together, they always do ask this question: what are the basic entitlements that we want to secure to each and every citizen? So, in my view, the capabilities are the way we answer that question. We say that it's really certain capabilities are opportunities. They're spheres of choice that have been put in place for people. In other words, the capability of religious liberty, freedom of conscience, doesn't mean you have to go out and function in accordance with religion, but it's a space of real opportunity that you can avail yourself of. And that's true also with health and education. That is, I believe in compulsory education for children. That's an exception. But on the whole, what we're interested in is spheres of opportunity, not compulsory functioning.
A nice example of what you're talking about there is one you've used yourself, which is the idea of someone fasting.
Yeah.
So we might say, well, for someone to be flourishing is for them to be eating the right amount for a human being. And clearly some people do not eat the right amount for a human being for a particular period, but that doesn't mean they lack the capability to do so. It means they're not doing it right at that moment. So that's the distinction that you refer to as the distinction between capability and functioning.
Yeah, and there are two reasons for focusing on capability. One reason is that any comprehensive ethical conception that I personally would favor would make room for spheres of choice and would say that what matters is that you choose it, not that you have it thrust upon you. But more important for political purposes, where every modern nation is irreducibly plural, and people have different comprehensive conceptions of value. And like John Rawls, I think that you're only justified in introducing political principles if, in principle, they could command an overlapping consensus of all the reasonable comprehensive doctrines. But that means that you have to try to figure out what people could possibly agree on. And I think it's clear that they couldn't agree on a list of functions that constitute human flourishing, but that everyone should have certain opportunities is a different story. Because take fasting. Now, some religions think that you shouldn't be well-nourished for certain parts of your life. But, of course, to have opportunities for nutrition, that they could sign on to. Some people, again, think that religion is really awful, and if you're a Marxist, you would think that. But on the other hand, they needn't be opposed to religious liberty, and I think most people who have that view today are perfectly happy to defend liberty of conscience, or take even voting. Now, some nations do have compulsory voting, and then people like the Old Order Amish, who think that it's actually against their religion to participate in politics, are under great stress there, but in my view, they wouldn't have to do that. They have full opportunity, but they aren't forced to go out and do it. Now, often it's very hard to tell when a person really has the opportunity, except by seeing whether a sufficient number of them actually go out and do it. So that's a measurement problem. That's an epistemological problem. But theoretically, there's a reason why we shoot for capability and not actual functioning.
So the core of the approach is to think a bit about what are the basic capabilities or opportunities a person needs to have in order to live a fulfilling life. What are those opportunities, in your opinion, that a person needs to have?
Well, I have this list. It's tentative. It can always be revised, and it's really a template for persuasion and discussion. But there are 10 that I put on the list, and I spell each of them out a little bit more concretely. But life, bodily health, bodily integrity, the development of senses, imagination, and thought, under which I include things like basic education, but I also